On this Friday night, multiplying accusations Russia is using banned weapons. The fresh bombardments, cities under siege as food and supplies run out. Plus, why NATO is rejecting Ukraine's plea for a no-fly zone. Europe's largest nuclear power plant now in Russian control. And criminalizing the news, Russia's latest crackdown on independent media. Crude awakening.
It's ridiculous.
The unprecedented rise in gas prices, why the war is only partly to blame. And steering Ukrainian refugees to safety.
They said, "You're our hero."
The Alberta man in the driver's seat.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The head of NATO says there is human suffering and destruction on a scale not seen in Europe since the Second World War. And he accused Russia today of using banned weapons.
We have seen the use of cluster bombs. We have seen reports of the use of other types of weapons which will be in violation of international law.
Cluster bombs detonate in midair, scattering munitions and killing indiscriminately. There were fresh pleas from Ukraine for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over the country. NATO again refused, saying that would risk a full-fledged war in Europe. Well, that prompted an angry reaction from Ukraine's president. Everyone who dies from today will die because of you, said Volodymyr Zelenskyy, because of your weakness. He said refusing the no-fly zone gives Russia the green light to keep bombing. At that nuclear power plant, the fire is now out, but the Russian military is now in control of the plant. The U.S. envoy to the UN says the world narrowly averted nuclear catastrophe. Russian forces continue to make advances. The regions in red on this map show areas now under Russian control in the south, east, and north. The arrows show territory still under Ukrainian control, but where Russian troops are advancing, including in areas close to the capital, Kyiv. Our coverage begins tonight with Redmond Shannon.
A high-rise near Kyiv in flames in the moments after it's hit by a shell. As Russia's offensive across Ukraine intensifies and airstrikes hammer major cities. Rockets landing inside the capital too, bewildered citizens wondering where the next one will drop. These are fired at houses all over Ukraine, says this woman. I hate these people. They are not even animals. Across Kyiv, Ukrainians are resisting, digging in, building roadblocks in preparation for what's to come. New satellite images show the 60-kilometre Russian convoy. It remains stalled outside the city. The important Black Sea port of Mariupol is now surrounded by Russian forces. Its mayor says the city has no water or power and food is running low. Thursday's agreement between Ukraine and Russia on humanitarian corridors could soon be tested.
Missiles keep dropping on the civilians.
Calls are constant for a no-fly zone over the country. This councillor organising supplies for soldiers. Many are her friends.
And I decided not to fall down or cry. I decided to help to our army.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy rallied supporters across Europe with a rousing speech Friday, following reports he's survived 3 assassination attempts in the past week. If Ukraine falls, all of Europe will fall, he said. Vladimir Putin addressed neighbouring countries too, urging leaders against new sanctions, perhaps a sign the measures are working. A third round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine is set for this weekend, but compromise seems doubtful and peace is for now out of reach. Donna?
Redmond Shannon in London, thank you. Well, after heavy shelling overnight, that fire at Europe's largest nuclear power plant has been extinguished. UN and Ukrainian officials say no radiation was released from the facility located north of Crimea. But with this major plant now under Russian control and 3 others within striking distance, world leaders are accusing Russia of threatening the safety of the entire continent. Ukraine's president called it nuclear terrorism with the potential to have caused much wider damage, including in neighboring Poland. That's where our Mike Armstrong is tonight.
It was something locals had worried about for days. Hoping to keep the fighting away from the nuclear power plant, civilians had even set up blockades. It wasn't enough. Russian troops attacked overnight in what is being called a first in history, a full-out firefight over a nuclear power plant. Surveillance video appears to show bullets, tracers, and artillery shells being fired. There are also images of a flare lighting up the area. There was a fire that started, it was extinguished. That fire was in a training building, not a part of the plant that produces power.
This is our worst nightmare come true.
This nuclear expert says the world may have dodged a bullet. If a shell had hit in the wrong place or a cooling system had been knocked offline, there could have been a disaster.
I seriously doubt the Russians are targeting nuclear power plants. That would be crazy. But accidents happen in war all the time.
With 6 reactors, the plant is Ukraine's biggest. It's now under the control of Russian forces. The company that operates the facility says its staff is still working, but it is having trouble communicating with them.
We, of course, are fortunate.
According to the International Atomic Agency, none of the reactors were affected and there was no release of radioactive material.
The operator and the regulator been telling us that the situation is naturally continues to be extremely tense.
Russian officials claim their soldiers came under fire from the plant by what they call Ukrainian saboteurs. Now, the Ukrainian president is appealing to the Russian people. In this address, he urged them to remember the 1986 Chernobyl disaster when the two nations fought that catastrophe together. Now, even if this was just part of the Russian advance as it tries to take over more territory and not an actual attack on the plant, it was reckless. Most of the concern about a wider spread in this conflict has been about nuclear war, but with 4 active major nuclear power plants in Ukraine, a nuclear accident is another thing to worry about. Donna?
Certainly is. Mike Armstrong in Poland, thank you. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today echoed NATO's position, rejecting Ukraine's multiple requests for a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
The thing that we have so far avoided and will continue to need to avoid is putting a situation in which NATO forces are in direct conflict with Russian soldiers. That would be a level of escalation that is unfortunate, that we need to avoid.
The American Secretary of State said today Russia has never been more isolated. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting today. The European Union said it wants to welcome Ukraine as a member as quickly as possible. Jackson Prosco reports.
Mr. Putin must stop this madness, and he must stop it now.
An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council brought international condemnation of Russia's shelling and seizure of Europe's largest nuclear power plant.
This is the first time that a state has attacked a fueled and functioning nuclear power plant.
Moscow delivered only more defiance.
Another attempt by the Kyiv authorities to kindle artificial hysteria about what is taking place in Ukraine.
There's little sense Vladimir Putin sees reason to change course now. After NATO foreign ministers agreed they will not grant Ukraine's wish to establish a no-fly zone, even as the alliance predicts more bloodshed.
The days to come are likely to be worse, with more death, more suffering, and more destruction.
The West seems to believe Putin may find his invasion unsustainable. Sanctions have pushed Russia's economy to the brink of collapse. Russia's army has suffered heavy losses, and the Kremlin is now censoring news of the war at home.
President Putin totally underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they have been able to push back, to fight back, and to slow down the Russian advances.
And in defiance of Putin's demands, Ukraine is quickly moving closer to Europe. The EU said it wants Ukraine to become a member as soon as possible. While allies Canada and the United Kingdom were invited to join a meeting of European foreign ministers to shore up support.
Our goal is to make sure that we put maximum pressure on Russia.
Yet Ukraine believes it's not enough to deter Putin's grand ambitions, warning NATO may still have to take up the fight it is so desperate to avoid. Since the start of the invasion, there's been no formal contact between the American military and the Russian military. Fearing this could spiral into direct conflict, the two sides have now established a deconfliction hotline. Donna, the Pentagon says it works. They say they placed a test call and the Russians answered.
Interesting. Jackson Prosco in Washington, thanks. Russia's neighbors are anxiously watching this war play out. Latvia has NATO troops, including Canadians, on the ground conducting training missions. As Mercedes Stevenson reports from Latvia, the future looks very uncertain.
20 hours at a remote Baltic border crossing in the winter is a lot of time to think. And Dmitry Bykov has had a lot to think about as he waits in a long line of trucks to cross the border into his home country of Russia, hauling a load of goods to Moscow. Bykov used to be in the Russian military. He fears the war he thinks is wrong in Ukraine will see him back in uniform, drafted against his will.
They can send me even there, but why do I need it? It's scary, very scary.
Bykov says he wishes there was no borders and he could fly free like a bird, and global leaders would get along as well as the multinational truckers in this line do.
What's the difference? Russian or not Russian? We are all people.
Despite Dmitry's dream, there are borders, and they're complicated here in Latvia, which is flanked by both Belarus and Russia.
We're here at the border between Latvia and Belarus. Belarus is just behind me. You can see it back there, past the trucks that are lined up to go across the border.
The impact of the war being felt here too. This Belarusian truck driver says he's worried for his family in Ukraine. There are divides within Latvia over the war. 24% of Latvians are ethnic Russians. Many of them live in the region of Latgal. In Daugavpils, we found a clear generational split over Putin's actions. Lana says she's an example of that, part of an older generation with fond memories of Russia. She's glad Crimea was taken and says Ukraine antagonized Moscow. But she can't talk to her daughter about it because it's causing a rift. Her daughter is part of the younger generation who dislikes Putin.
The Latvian government is looking for reassurance from NATO and Western leaders to send a message to Putin that collective defense is still intact. That's a message that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will deliver himself next week when he travels here to Latvia. Donna?
Filling up is getting more expensive. Coming up, what's fueling record high gas prices? It's not only the war. If you've had to fill up your vehicle lately, you know the deal. Gas prices have reached record highs in some places. The invasion of Ukraine is part of the reason, but it's more complex than that. Canada hasn't imported oil from Russia in years, and crude prices are for oil that will be delivered next month. Mike Drolet explains what's going on.
It's fair to say Canadians have never seen a hike in gas prices quite like this.
As I watch the gas go in the car, I see the dollar figure rising almost twice as quickly as the liter figure.
Across the country, records are breaking. $1.66 a liter in Toronto and Halifax may be hard to swallow, but look at Montreal at $1.79.9 or Ottawa at $1.94.9. And then there's Vancouver, which has now topped $2 a liter for the first time ever.
Outrageous, like $75 doesn't even give me 20 kilometers.
The war in Ukraine is the easy scapegoat, but it's far more complicated than that.
Any direct or indirect dealings in Russian sovereign debt.
Earlier this week, Canada shut its ports to Russian cargo ships, a largely symbolic move since Canada hasn't imported much oil from Russia since 2019. A pair of tankers have already been turned away. They're carrying Colombian fuel to Irving Oil in New Brunswick. But the ships themselves are Russian-owned.
This Ukraine-Russia situation has got everybody just following the bouncing barrels down the hill. And the cost of crude is going through the roof, and the speculation on where gasoline prices will go, insofar as the futures market is concerned, is just out of control.
That uncertainty is playing a big role in driving up prices. If sanctions are expanded to include Russian oil, Europe, which imports 40% of its gas from Russia, will have to bid against the rest of the world, including Canada, for available supply.
This is not a thing where you turn the switch off and on chocolate or vanilla milkshake. It's going to take a long time to get this back on track.
To make matters worse, what we're seeing in oil prices today doesn't impact the price at the pump until next month. So fill up now. This is going to be an expensive ride. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Ahead, the risks for Ukrainians fleeing the country and those who have stayed behind. There's a massive humanitarian push to help the people of Ukraine. The UNHCR says more than 1.2 million have left Ukraine in the last 8 days. Most have crossed into neighboring Poland and Hungary. Thousands are being welcomed into Germany. Europe is granting them special protection, circumventing asylum procedures and giving them access to health care and housing. But the flood of people leaving their homes is happening so fast, it's creating huge challenges. Jamie Morocker reports.
Grabbing her first meal after crossing the Polish-Ukrainian border, Katerina Herikova looks almost relieved.
I took money and my documents and that's all, maybe one t-shirt.
The 25-year-old is safe and has plans to go to a small city outside of Warsaw. But for thousands of others who don't have set plans, there are hurdles they will face.
If you have a large number of people migrating in a short period of time, they're at risk of infectious disease. Right now, COVID is a big one.
As the war began, COVID cases in Ukraine were up 555%, according to a UN report. Vaccination rates are fairly low at just 36%.
COVID is not their main priority right now, obviously. They're a lot survival and taking care of their kids and making sure they get a next meal as they flee is going to be their main priority.
Paul Spiegel is the director of the Center for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins. On Wednesday, the Canadian will be flying to Poland to support the World Health Organization's refugee emergency response.
You do everything from tracking the actual outbreak, surveillance, to then treatment, and it's labor intensive, and that will be much more challenging in Ukraine proper than outside.
Forced into tight quarters, basements and bomb shelters, COVID, tuberculosis, measles, chickenpox, and even polio could threaten lives, experts say. Shelling has damaged water systems, and communicable diseases are now also becoming a concern. For those who do get sick, hospitals are already overwhelmed with traumas, and access to essential medicine has dwindled. Although a humanitarian corridor has opened, the need is outpacing supply. For this 19-year-old who escaped, the shock of leaving home is setting in.
Nothing can be important than my family.
The responsibilities host countries now have is keeping them healthy and safe. Jamie Morocker, Global News, Toronto.
Compelled to act, a Canadian's courage and kindness. What's unfolding in Ukraine is driving thousands of people to ask what they can do to help. For one Calgary father who is visiting family in a country near Ukraine, the answer was simple. Jamie Dahl has his story.
It is impossible to measure heartache, but we can all feel it. And in witnessing moments like these, a father forced to say goodbye to his little girl and wife, not knowing if they'll ever see or hold each other again, it's hard to detach from the pain being felt in Ukraine.
I'm emotional now just thinking about that, but I know what that would feel like, and no parent should have to go through that.
But Dan Koska needed to do more than just bear witness. He's a father of two from Calgary. He and his family were in neighboring Slovakia visiting loved ones when war broke out.
There was no question in my mind. I was so determined to get to the border and help some people.
Loaded up with supplies and food, he drove 500 kilometers from the Slovakian capital to the small stretch of Ukrainian border, where the UN reports more than 90,000 people have crossed already, seeking safety.
They were woken up at 6 a.m. on the morning of the invasion by a bombing of the airport near their town.
2 days after he got to the border, Kotsko was back on the highway with these two women and their children who had survived a harrowing escape from Ukraine, leaving their husbands behind.
They were exhausted, relieved. Several times they referred to me, they said, "You're our hero." And it was very touching to hear that, and I just smiled and accepted it. And at the same time, I thought, I'm not doing anything very brave. I'm doing something compassionate, but not brave. The brave people are the people they left behind, the men who are fighting this war.
We caught up with the women, now safe in Slovakia's capital.
Some Slovak people give us a flat, free, no, without any payment. We are brave, and all our citizens are very patriotic. We hope and we believe that Ukraine will win. And I think it will be not win just for Ukraine. It will be win for all world.
Koska is heading back to the border this weekend with more supplies and space in his car.
You need good people to help other good people because the war is so ugly.
War is indeed ugly. Thankfully, there are many working so hard to show compassion amidst the turmoil. Jamie Dahl, Global News, Calgary.
And we leave you tonight with another war going on, the fight to control information. In Russia, the Kremlin silences political opponents and controls the state media. Today, it went a step further, making it a criminal act to stray from the Kremlin narrative about this war. The Duma, the Russian parliament, unanimously approved a draft law, making it a criminal offense to call what's happening in Ukraine a war or an invasion. Anyone who says otherwise and is convicted faces up to 15 years in jail. In response, the BBC's interim director tweeted this: "It's with a heavy heart that we have to suspend BBC News operations in Russia until we assess the impact of new laws which outlaw independent journalism." Multiple news organizations have followed suit, and in Russia, multiple sites are blocked, including BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, for what the Kremlin calls discrimination against Russian media. Russia's TV reign held its final broadcast last night. No to war were the final words. Staff walked off the set, leaving this. The Russian ballet Swan Lake. It's what aired on Russian state TV in August of 1991, after the failed coup attempt that marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Thanks for watching.